in and search for DZRJ. And now you can choose and enjoy DZRJ 810 AM and RJFM 100.3 anytime and anywhere. Hey, it's free.
The views and comments of the hosts and guests are not necessarily those of the station.
Hello, Philippines. This is the World News Jam on DZRJ and Radio Bandito TV. My name is Eric Lecain, coming to you live from the beautiful Makati, Manila. We here at the Jam talk about the top news stories going on around the world, stuff that happened last week to prepare you for the week to come, keep you updated with everything that's going on outside of the Philippines. Now, this week we will talk about everything from the situation in Israel with the ceasefire, also the possibility of ending the war in Ukraine or not, a report on climate change, Elon Musk up to now, and lots more. So let's get to the jam. First off, I wanted to update you on the situation in Israel. Well, so far, the ceasefire is holding. 5 and 6 hostages due to be released have already made it to Israel as of last week. The first two this past Saturday in southern Gaza. One of the October 7th attack, one all the way back from 2014 that was being held by Hamas. Meanwhile, in a very choreographed release of 3 other hostages that happened down in central Gaza, when they were being released, several children appeared on stage wearing shirts with photographs of Hamas leaders who had been killed. One of the hostages blew a kiss to the crowd. Whether that was a kiss for the crowd or a goodbye kiss to Hamas, that's unclear. But the last of the 6 finally was released yesterday. That person was held in captivity since 2015. Now, as a trade, Hamas expects Israel to release 602 Palestinian prisoners and detainees in the exchange of those 50 that have been sentenced to life imprisonment. Another 60 are serving long sentences, while 445 were detained in Gaza since from the Gaza October 7th, 2023 incident. They've all been held without charge. The captives being released this past Saturday are the last living hostages who Israel and Hamas agreed to exchange from the ceasefire agreement made in Qatar. But there's some issues. First of all, Israel has delayed the expected release of the hundreds of Palestinian prisoners and the detainees. Why? They don't like the ceremonies that Hamas holds when they release the Israeli hostages. They are stating that it's humiliating. Now, of course, the officials of Hamas are immediately saying that Israel has violated the ceasefire agreement. But Israel is saying that it was Hamas that violated the agreement by showing videos and using public displays to demean the dignity of the hostages. The video that they shows 2 Israeli hostages in the back of a vehicle watching the others being released. In the video, they are pleading to the Prime Minister Netanyahu to secure their release. Another issue in the hostages release is from the Hamas return of the remains of one of the deceased hostages. Supposedly one of the hostages was supposed to be returned along with her 2 dead sons' remains. But when Israel checked those remains, the forensic test confirmed that it was her sons, but not her. In fact, it was later discovered it was a Gazan woman who was accidentally returned. This, of course, infuriated the Prime Minister Netanyahu, who vowed revenge, nearly ended the ceasefire agreement right at that very moment. However, Hamas found or had the correct body, and it was then later received the following day, saying it was just a mix-up. It was confirmed she and her sons, one 8 months, the other 4 years old, were killed while living in captivity. According to the forensic examinations, it seemed the children were killed just weeks after October 7th. The report goes on that they were killed by someone's bare hands. Hamas had claimed that the mother and her children were killed because of an Israeli airstrike. However, the Israeli Defense Forces now disputes that, of course. The IDF spokesman said the entire world must know exactly how the Hamas terrorist organization operates. These two children were murdered, and then on Thursday their bodies were returned in a cynical and cruel ceremony in Gaza. 𝗪છી𝗿𝗋𝗆, who was meant to be returned with her children to Israel as part of their agreement, was not returned to Hamas. Hamas lied and violated the agreement. Now, of course, that woman was eventually turned, but that damage was already done. That particular official goes on, the body that Hamas falsely claimed was Cherie's was not hers, nor was it any other hostage. Instead, Hamas sent over the body of an anonymous woman. This is further evidence of Hamas's barbaric cruelty, end quote. But Hamas has claimed that this was just a simple mistake. They said that the Israeli airstrike that killed the woman and her children, that when they were removing the bodies from the rubble, it just got mixed up with some unnamed Gaza woman. Okay, fine. But then, to the surprise of many, Hamas has asked for the return of the Gaza woman. Still hasn't been identified. If the other 4 bodies are delivered next week, then that will conclude the phase 1 of the agreement. This leaves 63 Israeli hostages left, or 67, depending on where you get the info from, and 32 of those actually are believed to be dead already. However, Hamas says it is prepared to turn over all the hostages, both living and dead, if Israel agrees to completely withdraw from Gaza. That is something that has not been completely agreed to yet, but it's on the table. Now, just to be clear on where we are now, there are 3 stages in this ceasefire agreement. Stage 2 is coming soon, and it calls for the release of all remaining living hostages. That number is still not exactly clear, but it's also contingent on the release of more Palestinians from the security inmates, including the ones that they are holding up currently. So far, 137 of the 251 hostages abducted on October 7th have been released. The number of those 250, many of course are deceased now. However, they're still a bargaining chip for Hamas. The problem is that any small deviation from the agreement can easily cause the whole thing to fall apart, and Israel is very ready to go back to war immediately. In fact, that almost just happened yesterday. We have to remember tens of thousands of Gazans have already returned home. If the war were to start up again, and that would happen very quickly, it's hard for all those people to get out again. Remember, Netanyahu doesn't really want this ceasefire. Remember, many in his party want all Palestinians either dead or removed from the country. So what could it take to start up this war again? Well, maybe 3 bus bombings in Tel Aviv. This past Thursday, the 3 bombs were set to go off in buses. But when the bombs exploded, they were in parking lots and were empty. They were all about 500 meters apart. There was no injuries, but what if there were? Another bomb was actually found, but it was undetonated, thank God. The Israelis are calling it a botched attack. The The bombs are crude, resemble those of the type of bombs that are found in the West Bank. Interestingly, there was a note attached to one of the bombs that read, "Revenge against the 𝗡𝗲𝘄𝘀 camp," referring to the Israeli operation in the West Bank that happened last week. They believe this was supposed to be a coordinated attack that was supposed to happen on Friday morning during the pre-Sabbath rush when buses in Israel are usually very crowded. The problem was that the bombs went off too early, and the plot was quickly unraveled before anyone could get hurt. As a precaution, all U.S. Embassy employees are prohibited from riding buses in Tel Aviv for now. As of now, 3 people, 2 Israelis and a Palestinian, are being held in connection with those bombs. But this is the problem now, and in the past, and in the future. Once a ceasefire agreement is made, it just takes one bullet to disrupt the whole thing. Now, the ceasefire agreement in Gaza is still holding, but you can almost feel the ice cracking beneath the feet of Israel. Not sure how much longer it will hold. The second phase is coming, but will it even get to the negotiating table? Hamas is still saying that Israel must completely leave the Gaza Strip or the deal cannot move forward. Israel is saying that Hamas military cannot continue to exist and they can under no circumstances be allowed to govern. How will they ever get past this? And in the middle of this, you have Donald Trump, who said that all Palestinians need to leave and give Gaza to the U.S. so they can build luxurious condos. Also, Trump currently backs Netanyahu and is fine continuing to supply them with weapons. Does this mean that Iran is going to continue to supply weapons to Hamas? By the way, Israel is still saying that it's coming for Iran. And what about the West Bank? That's still fighting going on there. They're even now trying to blow up buses. Thank God no one was on one of those buses. That would have ignited a whole new war. I just wonder, where do we go from here? Is peace in the Middle East ever going to really be possible? Maybe we just need the current leaders to get old and have hope for any new ones. This is Eric Lecain on the World News Jam right here on DZRJ Radio, talking about the biggest stories from around the world. So, President Trump shocked the world this week. I'm sure at this point you're not exactly sure what thing I'm going to be talking about. He does shock us a lot lately. But it's about the Ukrainian war, which, according to Trump this week, was started by President Zelensky. He calls Zelensky a dictator, and that he won't hold elections because his support among his voters is near rock bottom. Trump said of Zelensky, "You've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal." I guess the question is, what kind of deal could Zelensky have made? I mean, in reality, there was no deal to be made. Putin amassed on the border of Ukraine his army and said several times he would not invade the country. But then, why would you be amassing thousands of troops? Anyway, Putin was not telling the truth because he did invade the Ukraine. His plan was to take the country in a few days and absorb it back into Russia. His reason, according to him, was to protect Russian-speaking civilians in eastern Ukraine and prevent the country from joining NATO. But that was February 24th, 2022, almost 3 years ago to the day. Putin actually started his invasion, really, back in 2014 when he illegally annexed Crimea Peninsula and started an armed aggression in the eastern Ukrainian region of Donbas. That conflict simmered until around 2022 when Putin ordered what he called military exercises along the Ukrainian border. He told the world that the roughly 150,000 soldiers that he had amassed would not be used to invade the Ukraine. But in the early hours of February 24th, just 3 years ago, Russia launched widespread airstrikes and soldiers began pouring over the border. They began taking over towns and brutally killing civilians. The Ukrainians had to scramble and get their military organized, and they did but many military had to die to hold the Russians back. Since then, the Ukraine has been in chaos. Martial law was enacted as the government tried to keep its people from being killed. But Trump last week said this: we have a situation where we haven't had elections in Ukraine, where we have martial law, a dictator without elections. Zelensky better move fast, or he's not going to have a country left. It's actually true that the Ukrainians were supposed to have an election in 2024, but they're in the middle of a war. People are dying every day. How can you have a free and fair election when your enemy is in your country and is trying to kill you? Also, the Ukrainian law prohibits parliamentary or presidential elections during the state of martial law, so there has not been an election, and Zelensky has remained in office. He said he believes elections will be held in Ukraine after martial law is lifted. The country would need to amend the law if it decided to hold a vote, which they are not going to do. Also, there's a huge part of the people of Ukraine that are not even there right now. There are nearly 7 million refugees scattered in different places outside of the country. How would they be able to vote? And what about the 800,000 soldiers currently fighting against Russia? How do you pull them off the front lines to vote? Also, what about the people that are in the towns that are currently being occupied by the Russians? How can they have an election there and hope that there is not a problem with counting the votes? And if you packed people into polling stations, wouldn't that give Russia an easy target to kill people? One more thing. Is Zelensky's poll numbers rock bottom, as Trump suggests? The answer is, well, his numbers are a lot better than Trump's this week. Right now, in a poll released at the International Institute of Sociology, he is sitting at around 57% approval right now. Trump also said millions of people have been killed, millions, including the soldiers. Big percentage of their cities knocked down to the ground. He said, I don't know how anybody even lives there. But in reality, 46,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed since the start of the war. The civilian deaths, it's hard to calculate, but it's in the tens of thousands, not really millions. Now, this is in stark contrast to the estimate of Russian soldiers, which could be anywhere from 300,000 to 800,000. This is a huge gap because how they do battle tactics. Russians don't really worry whether the soldiers live or die, only that the military executes its objectives. But one of the big things Trump said this week is that the U.S. gave the Ukrainians $350 billion, and they don't know where half of the money is. All right. In reality, Congress has only appropriated $183 billion, but some of that money is not actual cash. Some of it's in military equipment. This is how the U.S. does these types of things. They give contracts to U.S. military companies who get paid by the U.S. government to make military equipment, which is then shipped to the Ukraine. But Trump continues to say that Zelensky has strong-armed the U.S. into paying for a war that he could never win. Really? It's hard to believe anyone would strong-arm the U.S. Trump claims Zelensky is on a gravy train, and if Biden was still president, that we would be going into World War III. Zelensky said later that Trump's statements are based on a web of disinformation. But even with this back and forth of statements, it's becoming apparent to me that most of the world that Trump is beginning to change America's policies that it had with its European allies since 1941. Trump is moving the U.S. more toward a friendship with one of its most bitter enemies in history, Russia. The U.S. is currently negotiating a ceasefire with Russia in their best interest. Europe is not even invited. In fact, the Ukraine is not even invited. But if they come to a deal, is Ukraine going to even accept it? What if they don't? I mean, what will that mean? The Trump administration took an offer to Zelensky, said he needed to sign away 50% of their mineral rights to the U.S., or the U.S. will not support them anymore. They gave him 1 hour to sign it, basically telling Zelensky he needed to sign it, to which Zelensky said, listen, I need to talk to my people first. But supposedly the U.S. was really pressuring the Ukraine. I mean, they wanted to sign right away millions of lithium deposits. I mean, who would actually get those lithium deposits in the end? Tesla? Is this what the U.S. does now? I mean, the U.S. knows what will happen if Zelensky loses their support. I guess the question is, where does this leave Europe? Can Europe fight this war with the Ukrainians? Can they beat Russia without the U.S.? What if that happens and the U.S. doesn't back Europe against its common enemy? Also, we have to think about afterwards. If Europe cannot defeat Russia and Russia takes Ukraine, where does that leave the U.S.? Will they join with Russia and North Korea, even China? And what if Europe prevails? Europe and the Ukraine win. They're able to thwart Russia. Well, the U.S. will be left alone with no Western allies. Even if there's another president in 4 years, the problem will be from now on, can you even trust the U.S.? Can you even trust democracy? There may be a friendly president that makes all kinds of good deals, but then in 4 years, there might be one that tears it all down. What if Trump makes a deal with Putin? I know I said this already, but if he does, and then Zelensky says no, which by all accounts he's going to, this war could end up being much worse. If the Europeans get involved in this conflict, the U.S. may have to get involved. Would the U.S. fight alongside Russia? Maybe this is more like what you would call World War III. This is Eric Lecain on the World News Jam on DZRJ Radio and Radio Bandito TV. Let's get over to some climate change. So this is an interesting thing. There's a report that's coming out in 2029 on climate change. The report is made by the world's leading scientific authority on climate change, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC. Now, the IPCC assesses how the climate crisis is affecting the planet according to the latest science. It reports it takes thousands of scientists many years to produce this. And this report is used to inform policymakers across the world on the risk posed by global warming. In a sense, all of the world's current accepted knowledge about climate change stems from the IPCC and its reports. They started this many years ago, with the first report being published in 1990. Actually, the last report was actually published in 2023. It was around 8,000 pages, and it had some pretty scary stuff in it. It detailed consequences of rising greenhouse gas emissions, GHG around the world, the destruction of homes, the loss of livelihoods, fragmentation of communities, as well as the increasingly dangerous and irreversible risks should we fail to ever change course. It also looks at the solutions for the problems of climate change. It identifies readily available and in some cases highly cost-effective actions that can be undertaken now, today, to reduce the GHG emissions and also scale up carbon removal and build resilience. But there's one big problem currently standing in the way of this report even being compiled. You see, many of the top scientists in this organization are under the purview of the U.S. government and currently the president of the U.S., Donald Trump, who explicitly does not believe in climate change at all. In fact, he calls it a scam. He calls it a hoax, something dreamed up by the Chinese. Currently, he is pulling the U.S. out of the Paris Accords, the worldwide group of countries that are trying to collectively fix the climate problem. Trump is rolling back regulations to cut emissions and diverting funding for clean technology innovation. The Trump administration is stripping away support for scientific research in the U.S. and overseas and anything else he can find that contains the word climate. He has removed all mention of climate change from the U.S. websites, and this week he went after the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He has ordered all scientists, working on this upcoming report to stop writing and put their pencils down. In fact, he wants them to stop working on anything related to climate change. An international meeting of the IPCC authors, it was scheduled to take place in China next week. Well, it's now in limbo because Trump has canceled all trips to that event. One of NASA's chief scientists, senior climate advisor, was supposed to co-chair the discussion, but has received their stop work order and is now not really sure what they should do next. The meeting in China was planned to talk about the next steps in the development of this report. A person involved in the report said that they were not sure what this means for the work going forward, or if the U.S. scientists will participate in the writing of the IPCC reports at all anymore. That the decision to exclude U.S. scientists significantly undermines this collaborative effort and risks compromising the process at a time when robust climate action is needed more than ever. But this is not the end of Trump's attack on climate change. In the past week, he has fired thousands of people from the Environmental Protection Agency and the Departments of Energy and the Departments of Interior. He's removing funds and energy rebates. He's stopping programs for low-income solar installations, electric vehicle chargers. He's threatened tariffs on allied nations that have permits for windmill projects. He said he will roll back hundreds of billions of dollars in clean energy tax credits. Taken together, Trump's actions mark a vast and coordinated attack on U.S. environmental policies by a president who has spent years denying the tenets of climate science and the reality of rising global temperatures. Analysts and advocates say the administration's moves threatens to reverse decades of painfully slow progress to curb planet warming pollution. The person running the program for the climate change at the Lawyers for Good Government said, "This shock and awe campaign will undo decades of bipartisan and international efforts to curb greenhouse gases, and if left unchecked, it will lead to the planet warming far beyond manageable levels." Now, why would Trump be so against programs that are designed to help people in generations to come? Part of it could be that the oil lobbyists give a lot of money to his campaign, or the fact that he has complained about windmills that make one of his golf courses look so ugly. Or it could be the fact that many right-wing Republicans in the U.S. believe that it's just not a real thing. So why try to fix it? Basically, why should we even care? So Trump has appointed his energy secretary. The new energy secretary, Chris Wright, who's in charge of climate change, said this about the goal to get to zero emissions by 2050. This all happened at a conference in London. He said, "Net zero by 2050 is a terrible goal. It's both unachievable by any practical means, but the aggressive pursuit of it, and you're sitting in a country that has aggressively pursued this goal, has not delivered any benefits, but has delivered tremendous costs." Chris recently also spoke at CPAC as well. He said that the last administration did all it could to make it harder to drill for oil and gas. But that will change now. The Trump administration is committed to making it easier for oil companies, not harder. Trump has made no secret of his disbelief in climate change. On the campaign trail, he would call Biden's climate change plans for the U.S. of the reduction of greenhouse gases the Green New Scam. He has said electric vehicles and wind turbines are a waste of money. He said that the ocean levels rise due to extreme temperature changes. This would not be so bad. In fact, it would make a lot more oceanfront properties available. And now that he is president, he has said that if people in the government with federal jobs speak out in promotion of climate initiatives, they will be fired. He has threatened to make the nation's disaster response agency go away. The EPA is expected to release a list of regulations it plans to scrap and replace with weaker standards or no standards at all. Even the EPA's core finding that greenhouse gases endanger human health, the cornerstone of all climate regulations under the Clean Air Act, it may be on the chopping block now. The United States and the world were already on the clock when Trump won a second term in November. Current pollution levels, the planet has 6 years before the industrial ever rise in global temperatures eclipses the crucial threshold of 1.5 degrees Celsius, and 27 years before it breaches the even more serious benchmark of 2 degrees. The last president, Joe Biden, sought the position of the U.S. as the climate leader in the world. He approved $1 trillion in clean energy loans, grants, tax credits as part of a future plan for reduction of greenhouse gases. He even hired 6,000 full-time employees to help carry out the president's climate initiatives. In the private sector, companies that spent the past several years building factories to make solar panels and electric vehicles have only just begun to see their new products roll off the assembly line, but Trump has slashed these programs and already fired most of the people running them. At the National Science Foundation staff meeting, they're no longer recording any of the audio for fear it could fall into the wrong hands. Nearly 170 people were fired from the NSF on Tuesday, with more layoffs on the way. At the EPA, where 388 people were fired just last week, civil servants have been told to cut off communication with grantees and state officials until they can figure out what they're going to have to do next. All of this sounds bad, I know, but the one that worries me the most is the memo last Friday, a week ago. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security received a memo to stop all work related to climate change. The problem here is they deal with natural disasters such as the California wildfires. They are the umbrella for several offices, including FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. They deal with the aftermath of fires, storms, floods. These types of events have been getting bigger and worse and more severe in the past year. As I said, the global temperature has increased 1.5 degrees Celsius, making last year the hottest since they have even been keeping records. This is what led to the abnormally dry season in California, which just recently created fires that burned huge swaths of land. The question right now is, what is the rest of the world going to do? We have discussed on the show before of how poor countries actually take more of the brunt of the storms and the changing water levels than the richer countries. Right now, many of those poorer countries are hoping the countries around the world will step up in order to fill the gaps caused by the Trump administration. At the Climate Change Summit in Brazil, Ali Mohammed, the chair of the African Group of Negotiators and Kenya's Special Envoy for Climate Change, pointed to the record temperatures last year and the continuing extreme weather. He said, Africa is responsible for less than 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions, remains disproportionately affected by the intensity impacts of climate change. He went on to say, it's unacceptable that this devastation is caused by the pollution of just a few countries in the world, specifically the G20, and they must take responsibility for their actions. At the COP29 summit in Baku this past November, the countries most responsible for climate problems promised the less developed countries $1.3 trillion. But there's a catch. Only $300 billion would come from other countries. The rest would need to come from the private sector. Good luck with that. For many of the developing countries, such as the Philippines, this is just not good enough. If most of the emissions are coming from the rich companies like the U.S. and China, the poor ones are struck with having to deal with their forced problems, then they want a better settlement. Because without it, some countries are just going to get worse. And here we are. All this work, building and building up to this point. But will it really have any meaning without countries like the U.S.? Some of us won't live long enough to know what the outcome will be, but even though we can't see the future, we know what's coming. And it may take a lot more resolutions and summits from the world to fix this mess that we've gotten ourselves into. We just need to realize the U.S. is no longer on board the climate train. This is Eric Lecain on the World News Jam, right here on Radio Bandito TV, talking about the biggest stories going on around the world this past week. So, let's get to some U.S. news. This week, Elon Musk said he was going to send out an email to all federal employees. And in that email, it would ask you what you did last week. He said if you don't answer that email, then that would be your resignation. As we know, Elon Musk and the DOGE team, Department of Government Efficiency, which is made up of some very young recruits, have been going through government agencies and firing people left and right. This doesn't seem to really have any plan. Basically, if Elon doesn't like your department or it doesn't help him in some way, well, then you're out. Anyway, that email that he planned to send, well, he sent it on Saturday afternoon. And the email showed up in the inbox of all federal employees. In the subject line, it read, "What did you do last week?" In the body of the email, it said to make 5 bullet points about what you did over the past week and to CC your manager. It then said that certain government agencies will determine any next steps to whether you're fired or not. In other words, you can be fired if Elon just doesn't like what you wrote. Now, this almost has an elementary school feel to it. Remember when you would get that assignment to write down what you did over summer break? But back then, if your teacher didn't like what you wrote, she couldn't, fire you, kick you out of school. She could give you a D- for not taking the assignment seriously. Anyway, Elon shouldn't be able to fire no matter what you write. Most federal workers are covered by civil service protections, which clearly states you cannot be fired without cause. But unlike in elementary school, we usually got a week to write this, but Elon only gave them till Monday at 11:59 p.m. Some agencies, such as the Defense Department, told employees, "Oh, wait till you reply. Let's get some better guidance on how we should respond to such an email." I mean, the Defense Department does a lot of sensitive work for the government. You wouldn't want to write down in a bullet point, how you figured out the battle plan to invade Iran. The American Federation of Government Employees, which represents 800,000 civil servants, said that if anyone got fired because of an Elon Musk email, well, they would challenge it in court. The agency's president said, once again, Elon Musk and the Trump administration have shown their utter disdain for federal employees and the critical services they provide to the American people. He goes on, "It's cruel and disrespectful to hundreds of thousands of veterans who are wearing their second uniform in the civil service to be forced to justify their job duties to this out-of-touch, privileged, unelected billionaire who has never performed one single hour of honest public service in his life." End quote. This is not far from what Elon did when he bought Twitter. Remember that? He fired what seemed to be almost like everyone, getting rid of all those fact checkers first. And then his company Tesla, when he mandated weekly reports from his employees about what they did that week. Now, so far, there's even been a little pushback on this from within the Trump orbit. Kash Patel, who now heads the FBI, told his employees to hold off responding to the email until they had a chance to figure out how the employees should write this thing. Even the employees at the National Security Office were told to be very general about their answers. Don't talk about specific cases. Actually, the current head said, "If anyone gives you problems, I got you back." But even so, many are very worried because Musk has already put the axe to more than 20,000 government employees, even to agencies that we really need, such as the engineers at the National Nuclear Security Agency. Musk fired them. The guys that basically keep the nuclear weapons safe and secure, just out of nowhere, he fired 300 very specialized employees for no reason. How did Elon fire those people? Well, this is how he did it. Elon's security people just walked up to the employees sitting at their desk and told them to step away from their computers, then physically escorted them out of the building. All emails or documents that they had on their machine just wiped away. Now, many of these workers were fired just because of their status. They only had worked there for 1 or 2 years. They're the easiest ones to fire. But no one took the time to ask them what they did, only how long they worked there. The problem was that some of the employees had been there for many years, but recently had just switched jobs. Many of those fired were managers overseeing highly skilled scientists, engineers, and technicians who build, maintain, and guard the U.S. arsenal of some 5,000 nuclear weapons. Also, officials that are there to prevent the stealing or the selling of nuclear weapons and materials. In other words, they keep tabs on all the nuclear weapons around the world to make sure that they don't get in the hands of someone that should not have them. But once Elon did this, experts and officials and congressmen said, hey, wait a minute. Do you have any idea what you just did? They demanded those people be put back in their positions and rescind the firings. But then there was another problem. They fired them so quick that they didn't keep any records on how to locate them. The employees' email accounts were removed or locked, so the only way to contact them was through their phone number, many of which they had to track down. The other problem was the brutal way that they were fired. Many of them were not so enthusiastic to come back after being let out by Elon's security people. So this is why many news people, officials, general public are asking, why are they doing this in the first place? Firing all these people at once is not really saving the country very much money. In fact, in many cases, it costs more to fire them. Many believe the whole point of doing this chaotic firing is just to demoralize the federal workforce, to weaken any resistance to Trump's buildup of his power to be able to do massive firings later on. It's also a way to fill the federal jobs with people that are only loyal to Trump, people that will look to Trump as a king rather than a president, something he actually called himself this week. Trump wrote on Truth Social, "Long live the king," had a picture of himself wearing a crown. Anyway, the problem with this kind of gangster policies is because of the agencies like the Nuclear Protection Agency. It requires a set of skills that are very difficult to find. Sometimes it takes years to train managers, engineers, and technicians to handle nuclear arms. And once you just up and fire people, how many in that field do you suppose that are going to want to take a chance accepting a job from you? I mean, you could get fired at any time for no reason. And this is not the only dilemma facing federal workers. If you're black, or you even have the scent that you are in any way related to a DEI hire, you're almost assuredly going to get fired by Musk. DEI, of course, stands for the diversity, equity, and inclusion. And Elon and his boys and Trump are going after anyone associated with that policy. Even if you were hired entirely on merit, but you just happen to be black or Hispanic or homosexual, the deck is stacked against you now. This week, Trump fired Air Force General C.Q. Brown, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the highest command you can have in the military. He was a fighter pilot. He was well respected by the military, an officer, and he was black. He was the only second black person to ever serve in that position. He oversaw the war in Ukraine, the conflict in the Middle East, but he also publicly supported the Black Lives Matter movement after the killing of George Floyd. Trump has decided to replace him with retired Air Force General Dan Lecain, who is also a white guy. Besides being a white guy, he also has none of the prerequisites for the job, including serving as either vice chairman or combat commander or service chief. But he is loyal to Trump, and he is white. They also fired the first woman to oversee naval operations and the only second woman to ever be a 4-star admiral, Lisa Frachetti, and the Coast Commandant Linda Fagan, who has actually been sworn in just the day before she was fired. None of these people were sent any formal notice that they would be fired. Pete Hegseth, the Fox News host, who is now the Secretary of Defense, had said in the past that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs needed to be fired. He had questioned C.Q. Brown, and had he gotten his job just because he was black. Now, Brown, who spent Friday visiting troops at the U.S.-Mexican border, drew attention to himself for speaking out about the death of George Floyd in 2020. While he knew it was risky, he said discussions with his wife and his sons about the killing convinced him that he needed to say something. But even when Brown made those comments, he was confirmed with the job with a Senate vote of 89-8. Right now, there's close to 100,000 federal employees that have been fired since Trump actually took office. That includes 7,000 IRS employees just weeks before tax season. And that's just since Thursday. Of course, Democrats say that Trump went after the IRS people now because the IRS would be short-staffed during tax season, making it hard for them to go after the mega-rich friends of his, as they are the ones that are most likely the ones that are going to cheat on their taxes, now that Trump is in the White House. Senator Ron Wyden said, as a result of these layoffs, the burden of tax enforcement will be skewed much toward working families and small businesses. Anyway, Elon Musk has it on his mind to fire as many people as he possibly can. The reason he gives is to save the taxpayers' money. But in reality, if he fires as many as he hopes to, it will barely put a small dent in the national debt. If Elon really wanted to save money, he would need to put maybe the military budget on the chopping block, or maybe Medicare, or maybe the SpaceX contracts. What if old Elon would cut the SpaceX funding? Yes, SpaceX is his company, and I wouldn't hold my breath on that one. This is Eric Lecain here on The Jam on DZRJ Radio, talking about interesting stories going on around the world. There's some crypto news this week, and I know we haven't done a lot of crypto news lately, not since Bitcoin took a major dive. But then, of course, it has climbed back to the mountain, even to the clouds right now. I think Bitcoin's running, 500,000 pesos for just one Bitcoin. But one particular crypto took a dive this week, and that could be the second most popular crypto in the world, and that would be Ethereum. Now, as we know from talking about this before, the price of crypto is based on word of mouth. The entire value is based on speculation. There's no company, there's no store, there's no product, just the idea of a product. A coin. That doesn't really exist. Many times, if someone buys a coin, then someone sees they bought it, and so another person buys it, and so on and so on. Eventually, the price will go up. On the other side, if people stop buying a crypto or there's some bad news, the price will drop. Well, this week, Ethereum had some bad news. Or maybe I should say some scary news. It comes from Bytebit, the crypto exchange. That's where you go to trade your dollars for crypto and store it. The problem is that the site was hacked. And I don't mean hacked like you left your FB account logged in at the internet shop. This was a very, very sophisticated hack. But the amount of money they took in crypto was mind-boggling. $1.5 billion worth. It's the single largest amount ever stolen from a digital platform. The Dubai-based crypto platform said an attacker gained control of a wallet of Ethereum and transferred the contents to an unknown address. Now, let me just say, If you steal $1.5 million on the planet Earth, you can hide it. But if you steal $1.5 billion, they will find you. But will they be able to find you if it's in a cryptocurrency? This may be the greatest heist in the history because it's untraceable. Now, Bytebit is the second largest crypto exchange by trading volume in the world. However, just after this news of what happened, people went on a surge to pull out their money. In the first day, they got 350,000 requests to withdraw all their funds. The hack happened when the company was making a transfer from a cold wallet to a warm wallet, basically unused to used. They do this in order to cover their daily trading. Somehow, when this was happening, the attacker was able to hijack the wallet and transfer all of the assets, $1.5 billion. The company called on the brightest minds in cybersecurity and crypto analytics to help it try and refund these hacked funds, offering a reward of 10% of the amount recovered, which could be $140 million if you get the entire amount back. Ethereum dropped by 4% following the news of the hack, but it's coming back. I already looked. It was down to around 151,000 pesos, but now it's back up to around 162,000. Now, here's something interesting. They believe the hack may have come from the North Korean state hackers that are paid by the government to attack institutions such as banks and crypto platforms. Now, of course, the big question is, do the people that lost all their money, did they ever get it back? Well, unlike FTX, Bytebit has funds to cover these losses. That must be a relief to a lot of people, but will crypto ever truly be safe? Like I said, you cannot hide $1.5 billion on the planet, but you could hide that much crypto. There's no way to trace it, which makes it great for hackers. Just not so great for the rest of us. Well, it looks like we're about out of time. This has been the World News Jam on DZRJ Radio and Radio Bandito TV. My name is Lecain. Thank you so much for joining us here on our discussion of stories going on around the world. Please join us next week for more interesting stuff right here on the World News Jam. Until then, everybody have a wonderful week and be safe out there. We will see you next time.
The views and comments of the hosts and guests are not necessarily those of the station.